February 28, 1942. The docks at Tanjung Priok, the port of Batavia, are dim and silent. Two exhausted Allied cruisers lie side by side in the humid night, the American USS Houston and the Australian HMAS Perth. Only days earlier, they had survived the disastrous Battle of the Java Sea, limping back with hulls scarred and decks blackened by fire. Now, there is no time for repairs. Japanese invasion convoys are closing in from every direction, and orders are clear: run for the Sunda Strait, reach the Indian Ocean, and escape to Australia if they can. The Houston has been at war for nearly 3 months without rest, her crew hollow-eyed from constant bombardment. The Perth, equally weary, has been fighting almost without pause since December. Ammunition is low, torpedoes scarce, but morale holds because of two men, Captain Albert Rooks and Captain Hector Waller, commanders who have already led their ships through infernos. As the engines thrum to life and the ship edges away from the pier, the faint lights of Batavia fade astern. Somewhere beyond the black horizon, Japanese warships wait in the dark, unseen. None of the sailors knows it yet, but this will be their final voyage. Within 24 hours, both cruisers will be gone. This is where the story begins. For the men of the USS Houston, survival had become a routine miracle. 4 times in less than 3 months, the ship had been reported sunk, and 4 times she came back, smoke-streaked but defiant. On December 8, 1941, the same day Pearl Harbor was attacked across the dateline, Japanese bombers struck her near the Philippines. She limped away. On February 3, 1942, 49 enemy bombers fell out of the sky over Java, trapping her under a storm of explosions that killed 48 men and wounded 25 more. The Japanese left no doubt that she was finished. They were wrong. 12 days later, the Houston was escorting a convoy of 4 troop transports from Australia toward Timor when 50 Japanese aircraft descended from the clouds. Captain Albert H. Rooks made the impossible choice. He ordered the convoy to break off and turned his ship straight into the attackers. The Houston took the punishment alone, drew the fire away, and saved every transport. She was torn open, but she refused to sink. The men began calling her by a new name, the Galloping Ghost of the Java Coast. Her companion, the HMAS Perth, carried her own legend. Commanded by Captain Hector Hardover Hec Waller, she had become one of the most respected ships in the Royal Australian Navy. Waller was fearless, broad-shouldered, calm, a sailor's captain. He treated his men like brothers and led from the front, maneuvering the heavy cruiser like a knife in a knife fight. His crew trusted him absolutely. Now, in the dying days of February 1942, 2 veteran ships and 2 seasoned captains shared one final mission: break out of Java through the Sunda Strait before the Japanese sealed it off. Around them, the Allied fleet lay in ruins. Dutch ships were gone, destroyers scattered. The Battle of the Java Sea had been a slaughter. 13 Allied ships lost. The Houston and Perth were the last still afloat. As their engines rumbled through the night, both captains knew the stakes. Ammunition was low, the crew is exhausted, and yet neither man hesitated. Captain Rooks whispered to his officers, "We're not done yet." Captain Waller said, "Set course west." 2 ships, 2 nations sailing together into the dark toward history. Below deck, the USS Houston barely resembled a warship. Torn cables hung like vines from the ceilings. Ammunition lockers were warped from heat, and twisted gun barrels lay half buried under scorched plating. The smell of oil and burned paint filled every passageway. In the cabins, personal belongings were scattered across the floor: books, uniforms, family photos, relics of men who no longer had time to clean up after battle. Her surviving crew called her a miracle. Others called her a ghost. The HMAS Perth was in little better shape. Her hull bore shrapnel scars from the Battle of the Java Sea, and the long months of combat had drained every man aboard. Sleep came in stolen minutes. Meals were cold and rushed. The engineers patched leaks with anything they could find. Yet, despite the wreckage and the fatigue, there was a fragile current of hope running through the fleet. If they could just reach the Indian Ocean, maybe, just maybe, they could live to fight again. At Batavia, Captain Hector Waller gathered his men. His words were calm, deliberate, but honest. "We sail again tonight," he said. "Sunda Strait is reported clear." His crew trusted him implicitly. But the ship's mascot, a small cat named Red Lead, seemed to sense what the men could not. 3 times she tried to leap ashore, hissing and clawing at the gangway. Sailors whispered nervously, "Bad luck," they said. Waller only smiled and ordered her brought back aboard. Nearby, Commander T.H. Binford, overseeing the few surviving American destroyers, radioed his superior in despair. "The bottom's dropped out. If we stay 24 hours longer, it'll be too late to escape." Still, the Houston and Perth prepared to leave, joined by a handful of smaller ships too damaged to follow. Their boilers hissed, their decks clattered, and their men stood ready. They were weary, half-starved, and surrounded by defeat, but they still believed their ships had one more fight left in them. Far to the west, unseen beneath the same night sky, a vast Japanese invasion force was already moving into position. The trap was closing, and the hunters had no idea their prey was sailing straight toward them. As night swallowed the western horizon, the USS Houston and HMAS Perth pushed into the dark waters of the Java Sea. Their destination was simple but desperate: the narrow Sunda Strait, the final passage between defeat and survival. The navigators plotted a westward course along Java's northern coast, their dim red lights flickering over worn maps stained with oil and sweat. The sea was calm, the moon veiled behind clouds, and the only sound was the dull hum of engines echoing off the steel decks. But beyond the horizon, unseen and unknown to either ship, an entire Japanese invasion armada was converging on Java. Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita's Western attack force was steaming straight toward them, a massive fleet built to crush any remaining resistance. Kurita commanded 4 heavy cruisers, including the Mogami and Mikuma, supported by the aircraft carrier Ryujo, 3 additional cruisers, and a full destroyer squadron. His ships escorted more than a dozen troop transports, carrying soldiers bound for the western coast of Java directly across the path of the escaping Allied cruisers. In Batavia, Allied radio intercepts had gone silent. There were no reconnaissance planes left, no scouts, no friendly destroyers to screen ahead. For Captain Albert Rooks and Captain Hector Waller, the sea ahead looked empty, but it was filled with teeth. Aboard the Houston, Aviator Lieutenant Commander Walter Winslow sat alone in his small cabin, staring at a carved wooden Javanese head he'd bought weeks earlier, a good luck charm he'd named Gus. As the ship's engines rumbled beneath him, Winslow whispered, "We'll make it through, won't we, Gus?" The figure stared back in silence. At 7 p.m., both cruisers cleared the harbor and turned west. Their wakes glowed faintly in the black water. The crews settled into their stations, unaware that less than 4 hours ahead, a Japanese destroyer was already waiting, its lookouts scanning the horizon for the silhouettes of 2 doomed ships. The Allied captains believed the strait was open. In truth, they were sailing straight into the heart of the Japanese invasion. The time was 10:50 p.m., February 28, 1942. The 2 cruisers, Houston and Perth, had slipped past Java's burning shoreline and were nearing Bantam Bay, unaware that the sea ahead was crawling with enemy ships. Out of the darkness, a lone silhouette appeared, the Japanese destroyer Fubuki. Her lookouts spotted the Allied vessels just as the cruisers, silhouetted faintly against the glow of the distant coast, spotted her. For a heartbeat, both sides hesitated. Captain Hector Waller, aboard Perth, thought it might be an American destroyer, but as the distance closed, recognition hit. "Jap destroyer," he snapped. "Sound the rattles, forward turrets open fire." The night exploded. The Perth's 6-inch guns roared, their muzzles spitting flame and thunder across the sea. Within seconds, more shapes emerged. 9 destroyers and 3 cruisers of the Japanese invasion escort closing in, rushing to trap the 2 Allied ships before they could reach the strait. Japanese gunners answered with fury. In the first few minutes, the destroyers launched 87 torpedoes, their white wakes streaking through the black water. The Allied captains executed tight turns, dodging through a forest of invisible death. Not one torpedo struck, but several sped on into Bantam Bay, slamming into Japanese troop transports and igniting them in flames. Explosions ripped across the shoreline, lighting the night like a hellish sunrise. The Allied cruisers fought back with everything they had. In the Houston, Lieutenant Commander Walter Winslow was jolted from his bunk by the thunder of guns. Running topside, he saw the tracers slicing through the air, reflecting off smoke and sea spray. How beautiful, he would later write, these emissaries of death. But as the Allied ships turned west, hoping to break out into the open ocean, the horizon ahead came alive with even more enemy fire. Searchlights pierced the darkness from every direction, blinding, white and merciless. The sea around them was no longer empty. It was a trap, a wall of steel and fire, and both ships were heading straight into its center. The HMAS Perth now fought in the center of a storm made of fire and steel. The sea around her was alive with torpedoes, 13 Japanese ships closing in, their silhouettes flashing white each time their guns roared. Shells screamed overhead, ripping into the water, hurling columns of spray skyward like geysers. Men shouted through smoke and confusion. Commands were drowned beneath the roar of engines and the thunder of guns. 4 torpedoes to starboard, someone yelled. 5 to port, another shouted. Then a third voice, trembling, furious. By God, they're all around us. The Perth's gunners fired until their hands bled. The main 6-inch batteries pounded the darkness, shaking the ship with every recoil. Smaller anti-aircraft crews joined in, their machine guns glowing red from heat. Captain Hector Waller moved calmly between posts, his uniform soaked with sweat and spray. Around him, men died at their stations, some vaporized where they stood, others carried below by shipmates who never came back. Enemy searchlights swept across the sea, locking onto Perth's hull and turning her into a perfect target. Waller muttered to his paymaster, Lieutenant Commander P.O.L. Polo Owens, "I'd rather face 1,000 bombers than one shelling like this." Torpedoes struck home. The first hit tore into the forward engine room, lifting the ship clean out of the water. A second ripped through her starboard side, flooding compartments and killing scores below decks. Fires raged from bow to stern. Below, N.E. Tiger Lions was thrown into the air as his station collapsed. Flames consumed the corridors, and boiling steam filled the compartments, scalding men alive. In one instant, a gun crew vanished completely, nothing left but twisted metal where they had stood seconds earlier. Still, the Perth's guns thundered. Even when ammunition ran out, sailors hurled practice shells and training bricks loaded with cordite, anything to fight back. But it was hopeless. The sea was filled with enemies. Their torpedoes struck like a drumbeat. At 12:25 a.m., March 1, 1942, Captain Waller gave his final command. Abandon ship. Some men still carried shells in their hands when they jumped. Others stopped to secure equipment or help the wounded before diving into the flaming sea. Torpedo crewman Ian Smith stayed behind just long enough to remove the detonators from the ship's depth charges, ensuring they wouldn't explode and kill those in the water, an act that saved dozens of lives. Moments later, the HMAS Perth rolled onto her side, her lights flickering once, then vanishing beneath the waves. The water boiled with debris, oil, and men struggling to stay afloat. In the chaos, Lieutenant F.O. Gillen found himself trapped below decks, corridors twisting as the ship listed sharply. He climbed through rising water, leapt over a gaping chasm, and finally clawed his way to a manhole. As the ship turned completely over, he held his breath and let the current drag him upward. Breaking through an oil slick, he gasped at the surface, watching the last bubbles rise from beneath him. He whispered softly into the night, "I'm the last man out of that ship alive. God, I thank you." The Perth was gone, but the battle was far from over. When the HMAS Perth slipped beneath the waves, the USS Houston was left utterly alone, one ship against an armada. The sea was burning. Japanese cruisers and destroyers circled like wolves, their searchlights cutting white paths through the smoke. The Houston's decks were slick with oil, her hull punctured and listing, but her guns still thundered. Captain Albert H. Rooks stood on the bridge, calmly giving firing orders as if directing a live-fire drill. At first, confusion reigned among the Japanese. In the smoke and chaos, their own ships began firing on each other, a grim gift that gave the Houston precious seconds. Her gunners took full advantage. 3 destroyers hit. 1 minesweeper sunk. Shells from the Houston's 8-inch turrets crashed into targets at point-blank range, setting 2 ships ablaze. The men cheered, even as death closed in. But the enemy adapted quickly. From every angle, torpedoes streaked toward her, white streaks slicing through the black water. One struck near the after-engine room, killing everyone inside. Another slammed into the bow, blasting through steel and sending molten shrapnel across the decks. Steam vented in lethal clouds, scalding men alive. Lieutenant Commander Winslow, the ship's aviator, watched as the deck erupted in a storm of fire and sparks. "The ship," he later wrote, "fought like a boxer, refusing to fall, even when he knew the end was near." At 12:20 a.m., a shell struck turret number 2, igniting the powder bags. The explosion tore through the forward deck, killing dozens instantly. Captain Rooks ordered the magazines flooded to prevent a chain reaction, a decision that saved the ship for a few more minutes, but cost them their remaining ammunition. Still, the crew fought with what they had: machine guns, rifles, even flares. Then came the final blows. 3 torpedoes slammed into the starboard side, one after another. The Houston staggered, fire spilling from her wounds. The ship slowed to a crawl, her power failing, her guns silent one by one. Japanese destroyers swept closer, raking the decks with machine gun fire. Men fell where they stood. At 12:25 a.m., Captain Rooks turned to his executive officer, Commander David Roberts, and shouted his last order: "Abandon ship." Moments later, a shell burst near the bridge. Shrapnel tore through Rooks's chest, throwing him backward. An officer caught him as he fell. Within seconds, the captain who had saved his ship so many times was gone. As Roberts assumed command, he delayed the order long enough for the hull to settle lower, sparing men a deadly drop into the sea. Amid the chaos, ensigns Charles Smith and Herbert Levitt found Rooks's loyal Chinese cook, Tai Chi-sa, nicknamed Buddha, cradling the captain's body. They begged him to jump. He shook his head, holding Rooks close. "Captain die, Houston die, Buddha die too." He went down with his ship. At 12:33 a.m., the USS Houston rolled heavily to starboard, fire lighting her decks one last time. She slipped beneath the water guns, still pointing toward the enemy. As men leapt into the burning sea, the galloping ghost of the Java coast had finally fallen. But she did not go quietly. The sea was on fire. When the USS Houston slipped beneath the waves, hundreds of men were thrown into a nightmare of oil, smoke, and silence. The surface burned with patches of flame, lit by the dying glow of the cruiser's wreck. Waves carried debris, shattered rafts, and bodies. The air reeked of fuel, gunpowder, and blood. Lieutenant Commander Walter Winslow broke the surface, gasping through a film of oil. Around him, men screamed for help, some blinded, some missing limbs. He watched the flag still attached to a fragment of mast flutter once in the breeze before disappearing beneath the water. As she went down, he later wrote, Our flag filled with wind one last time, snapping defiantly as if saluting her end. In the darkness, the enemy's searchlights swept back and forth. Then came the sound, the terrible, rhythmic chattering of machine guns. Japanese destroyers prowled among the survivors, cutting through the oil slicks and firing into the water. Men tried to play dead. Chief Boatswain's mate Otto Schwartz floated motionless, his face pressed into an air pocket inside his life jacket, praying they would pass. One destroyer came so close that a sailor prodded him with a rifle barrel. Schwartz held his breath, waiting for the shots that never came. After a moment, the ship backed away, leaving him alive. Nearby, Polo Owens clung to a floating plank beside a petty officer. Exhaustion dragged at him. He began to drift away, whispering, "Maybe it's easier to let go." The petty officer grabbed his arm and shouted, "For God's sake, don't leave me." That cry snapped Owens back to life and he held on tighter. Other acts of courage shone through the chaos. Commander G.S. Rentz, the Houston's chaplain, found himself on an overcrowded raft. To save the others, he slipped off his life jacket and whispered a prayer. "You men are young, I'm old. I've had my time." Then he drifted away quietly into the dark. Not all in the water were Allied. Survivors of the sunken Japanese transports clung to debris nearby. When one enemy soldier tried to climb aboard an Australian float, Seaman H.K. Gosden kicked him away, shouting, "You killed my mate, you bastards, killed my mate!" The sea had become a grave shared by friend and foe alike. For 15 hours the survivors drifted, surrounded by the cries of the dying and the groans of the wounded. Some prayed, some sang. Many simply stared upward, waiting for dawn. When it finally came, the water was calm, black with oil, silent except for the creak of drifting wreckage. The Perth and the Houston were gone. But their fight, and the men who refused to surrender even to the sea, would live forever. When daylight finally broke over Java's northwest coast, the survivors of the Houston and Perth drifted toward shore half dead, blistered, and covered in oil. For many, survival in the sea only led to a new kind of hell. Japanese patrols scoured the beaches, rounding up every man they could find. Exhausted sailors were herded at gunpoint through jungles and villages, their wounds untreated, their bodies trembling from dehydration. Lieutenant Lee Rogers of the Houston crawled onto the sand after 18 hours in the water. Villagers helped carry him and others to shelter, only for Japanese soldiers to arrive the next morning. When one guard heard they were Americans, he smiled and said in broken English, "Ah, baseball, Babe Ruth." The gesture was a small mercy. What followed was not. Chief Boatswain's mate Otto Schwartz and dozens of others were forced to pull supply carts like beasts of burden. The horses meant for the carts had been lost with the transports, so the prisoners took their place, dragging tons of equipment under the lash of bayonets. "If we stumbled," Schwartz remembered, "they jabbed us forward with rifles until we bled." Over the next days, the survivors of both ships were marched inland and dispersed to Japanese prison camps in Java, Singapore, Burma, and Thailand. There they joined thousands of other Allied POWs, enduring starvation, disease, and daily beatings. Many were sent to work on the Burma-Thailand Railway, where malnutrition, malaria, and exhaustion killed hundreds. Out of more than 1,000 men aboard the Houston, only 368 survived the war. From the Perth's crew of 682, only 229 lived to see home again. The rest died in the battle, drowned in the strait, or perished in captivity. For 3 long years, families in America and Australia heard nothing. The ships were listed as missing in action. Mothers and wives clung to rumors that perhaps their sons or husbands had survived somewhere in the Pacific. Not until 2 escaped prisoners reached Allied lines. In 1945 did the world finally learn the truth that the men of the Houston and Perth had gone down fighting against impossible odds, and that some had endured to tell the tale. They had not surrendered. They had endured the unendurable. The Battle of Sunda Strait changed nothing on the map, but everything in memory. By dawn on March 1, 1942, The waters off Java were quiet again, littered with wreckage, oil, and silence. The Japanese invasion went on as planned. Java fell within days. Yet what lingered was not victory, it was respect. Even enemy officers later admitted astonishment that 2 crippled cruisers had charged headlong into a fleet 20 times their size and fought until the sea took them both. When news finally reached home, it struck like a thunderclap. In Houston, Texas, the ship's namesake city launched an emotional rallying cry, "Avenge the Houston." A life-size replica of the cruiser rose in the city center as thousands enlisted beside it. On Memorial Day, 1942, more than 1,400 men took the Navy oath under its shadow. Across the Pacific in Australia, the name Perth became a sacred word, a symbol of mateship, discipline, and courage under fire. Captain Albert H. Rooks was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism in the line of duty. Captain Hector Waller received the Distinguished Service Order and the eternal loyalty of his crew. Both men went down with their ships, but their leadership outlived them, immortalized in the memories of the men who survived and the nations that remembered. Today, the wrecks of the Houston and Perth rest side by side on the ocean floor, silent, corroded, and still. Divers describe twisted metal and shattered guns lying in peaceful darkness, like 2 brothers asleep after battle. Each year, wreaths are dropped into the sea above them, their ribbons reading only, "We remember." They fought outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time, but not out of courage. Their resistance bought honor from defeat and left a message that still echoes through naval history. Even when all hope is gone, duty remains. This was the night 2 cruisers met the impossible and refused to surrender. This is their story.